All right, everyone, get ready, because today we are going deep, deep into the world of forever chemicals. You know them, PFAS. And yeah, we've got tons of research articles, news reports, expert opinions, a lot to unpack here. By the end of this, you're going to know enough to make informed decisions about PFAS in your daily life. So that's the goal today.
Well, and what I think is fascinating and frankly a bit disturbing is how these chemicals have managed to work their way into pretty much every single aspect of our lives. And most people have no idea.
Yeah, that's what's so scary. So, okay, first things first. What exactly are PFAS? I mean, I know I've seen the term, but I don't think I could really explain it.
So PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And it's not one chemical, it's actually a huge family of over 9,000 human-made chemicals. And they're so useful they resist like water, stains, heat, you name it, which is why they're in so many products, right?
That's a lot of chemicals. Is there like any regulation on which ones can be used?
Yeah, so unfortunately, that's part of the problem. The sheer number of these PFAS makes regulation and tracking incredibly difficult. Some are more tightly regulated than others, but yeah, the oversight isn't as comprehensive as it probably should be.
That's concerning. Especially since, we're going to get into where these things are found. It sounds like they're everywhere.
You're not wrong. I mean, think about it, nonstick cookware, waterproof clothing, firefighting foam, food packaging, even things like cosmetics. I mean, the list goes on.
So speaking of those everyday products,
Yeah.
let's talk about how PFAS actually get into our bodies. Our sources outline a few key pathways, I guess you could call them. And honestly, it's kind of scary.
Oh, yeah. One of the biggest ones is through our drinking water. And it's not just tap water. Even bottled water can be contaminated.
Wait, even bottled water. I thought that was supposed to be like the pure option.
You would think. But the thing is, the regulations around bottled water when it comes to PFAS, they're not as strict as you might think.
Wow, that's unsettling. So what else should we look out for?
Food packaging is another big one. You know those grease-resistant wrappers and containers we use for like takeout, convenience foods? They're often loaded with PFAS.
Okay, so that makes sense. But it doesn't stop there, right?
Unfortunately, no. PFAS can actually end up in the food itself. So, processed meats, butter, some teas, even some produce, fruits, and veggies have been found to contain these chemicals.
Oh my gosh, it's like a game of Where's Waldo with these forever chemicals. And it's not just what we eat and drink. Our sources also mentioned consumer products too.
Absolutely. Things like cosmetics, nonstick cookware, the stain-resistant fabrics, all of these can contain PFAS, and then they can be absorbed through our skin or even inhaled.
It's honestly overwhelming to think about how many ways we're exposed to this stuff. But what if our bodies, like, had tools to fight back? That's where this research on fasting comes in, right? I mean, it almost sounds too good to be true. What do you think?
It's really interesting research, and it's promising. It's still in the early stages. But there is some evidence suggesting that fasting could help our bodies get rid of these chemicals.
Is there, evidence that this works in humans? What kind of fasting are we talking about? It raises more questions than it answers.
I think you're right to be cautious because, yeah, a lot more research needs to be done. But one theory is that fasting, it boosts metabolism and liver function, which could, in turn, aid in detoxification.
So the liver is like a filter for these chemicals, and fasting might help it work better.
That's the idea, yeah.
Yeah.
There's also the idea that fasting can reduce inflammation, which some scientists think might actually contribute to PFAS accumulation.
So it's not just about the liver, but also about how our bodies react to these chemicals at a cellular level.
Yeah, that's one of the things they're looking at. It's all very complex, but it's definitely an area worth watching closely.
Totally agree. Okay, so now let's unpack the potential risks of these chemicals. Why should we be concerned about having them in our bodies in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, the answers are pretty scary. Exposure to certain PFAS has been linked to some pretty serious health issues. We're talking about an increased risk of certain cancers, liver, kidney, and testicular cancers. We're also talking about liver disease, thyroid disease.
And it doesn't stop there, right?
Yeah.
Our sources also mentioned hormonal disruptions, a weakened immune system, developmental problems in children.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're right. It's a long list. And to make matters worse, there are even concerns about how the FDA tests for PFAS in food.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading about that. Something about the testing methods not being accurate. Can you break that down a little?
Well, basically, critics are saying that the FDA's tests might be missing some of the newer PFAS chemicals, which means that they're underestimating how much contamination is actually in our food.
So the problem could be even worse than we realize.
That's the concern. And honestly, it just shows how urgently we need more, like, comprehensive and accurate testing. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with so we can figure out how to actually address it.
Okay, this is getting kind of intense, but before we get to like how we can combat this, I've got a question. If they're called forever chemicals, how are they getting into our water in the first place? Shouldn't they be, trapped somewhere?
That's a great question, and it kind of shows why PFAS are such a problem. They don't break down in the environment very easily, but they can leach out of products, and they can contaminate water sources through all sorts of, like, crazy ways.
So even if we're careful about what we buy, these chemicals can still get into our water.
Unfortunately, yes. Think about landfills, for example, where products that have PFAS in them end up. Rainwater can, like, seep through the trash, and as it does that, it can pick up these chemicals, and then it carries them into groundwater or surface water sources.
So it's not just about, our individual choices. It's about this bigger system that's letting these chemicals, like, stick around in the environment, right?
You got it. And that's why addressing the PFAS problem, it's not as simple as just making a few changes here and there. We need individual action, but we also need, like, systemic change.
All right, well, let's dive into those solutions because right now I'm feeling a little helpless. Where do we even start with, like, minimizing our exposure to this stuff?
Well, and I know it can feel that way, but knowledge is power, right? Once you understand the risks, you can start making more informed choices.
Okay, so what's step one?
Filtering your drinking water is huge.
Okay, but, like, aren't all water filters created equal?
Not when it comes to PFAS, no. Certain filters are much more effective at removing those. Reverse osmosis, for example. Distillation is another option. Those are really good at getting PFAS out of the water.
So reverse osmosis, just so everyone knows, that basically pushes water through incredibly tiny pores that are small enough to trap PFAS molecules. And distillation, that boils the water and then collects the steam, and that leaves all the contaminants behind.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. I'll definitely be looking into those. So filtering water, check. What about food? I know we talked about how PFAS can hide in all sorts of things that we eat, but are there, like, ways that we can lower our risk there?
For sure. In general, try to stick with fresh whole foods over processed foods as much as possible.
That makes sense. Less processing, hopefully fewer chances for PFAS to, like, sneak in. What about in the kitchen? Like, anything we can do there?
Think about your cookware. Non-stick pans are convenient, but they often contain PFAS, so go for alternatives like cast iron, stainless steel, ceramic. Those are much better options.
Good tip. And what about storing leftovers? Any suggestions there?
Ditch the plastic and go for glass or stainless steel containers. Plastic can leach chemicals into your food, especially when you heat it up. And, some of those chemicals could be PFAS.
Great advice. I'm already feeling a bit more empowered just knowing that, like, I can make these changes.
That's the spirit. Small changes add up, especially when we all do our part.
This has been so eye-opening already, but before we get into the really in-depth stuff, like how to fight back against forever chemicals, let's take a quick pause here.
It really is amazing, though, how many choices we make every day that can, like, impact our exposure to these chemicals. It's not just food and water either, right?
They're so right. And speaking of things we use every day, I'm kind of curious about clothing and carpets. I've heard they can be sources of PFAS, too. What can we do about that?
It's tricky, but there are things you can do. When you're shopping for clothes, for example, try to, like, stick with natural fibers, things like cotton or silk, linen, wool. They're generally less likely to have been treated with PFAS than, synthetic materials.
So it's about going back to the basics, like choosing materials that have been around forever, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Natural fibers don't usually need the same level of chemical treatment that synthetic fibers do, so less chance of PFAS being in there. And if you do need to buy something that's made from synthetic fabrics, you can always look for labels that say things like PFAS-free or PFC-free.
Good tip. What about carpets? Those seem like they would just be magnets for dust and whatever else is floating around in our homes.
Right. Carpets can definitely act as reservoirs for PFAS, especially if they've been treated with those, like, stain-resistant coatings.
So do we just rip out all our carpets and go for hardwood floors?
Well, that is one option, but, that might not be possible for everyone. If you do have carpets, regular vacuuming with a HEPA filter vacuum, that can definitely help. You can get rid of some of that dust, and that minimizes the amount of PFAS you're, breathing in.
Okay, that's good to know. It seems like, honestly, so much of this is just about reducing our exposure wherever we can, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's all about, making choices and minimizing risk as much as possible.
Speaking of making choices, one of our sources mentioned a study that actually um, linked specific types of foods to higher PFAS levels in the body. And I found that really interesting, but also a little confusing. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure, yeah. That study really showed how complicated this issue is. Basically, they found that people who ate a lot of processed meats, butter, certain teas, even drank a lot of bottled water, they tended to have higher concentrations of PFAS in their blood.
So even if we're super careful about filtering our water, choosing products that are PFAS free,
Yeah.
we could still be exposed through our diet. Kind of disheartening.
Yeah, and I think it highlights the fact that we need to be thinking about this holistically, right? You can't just focus on one area and ignore everything else.
That makes sense. We need to be mindful of everything, what we eat and drink and the products that we're using every day. And one thing that kind of stood out to me in that study was that they found that restaurant-prepared meals often had higher PFAS levels than if you, like, made the same food at home. What do you think that is?
I think it probably comes down to food packaging. You know, a lot of restaurants use those grease-resistant wrappers, containers, and things like that. And those often contain PFAS, and those chemicals can leach into the food, especially when it's hot.
So cooking at home is a better bet.
It could be, yeah. And even when you do eat out, you could always ask the restaurant about their packaging practices. Some of them are starting to switch to PFAS-free options.
Good to know. I will definitely be asking more questions from now on.
Mm-hmm.
It's empowering to know we have, more control than we think.
For sure. And speaking of food choices, there was another article that we looked at that explored the potential benefits of nuts, actually, in relation to PFAS.
Really? That's so interesting. All nuts or specific types.
This particular study found that while nut butter was linked to higher PFAS levels, probably because of the packaging, actually eating whole nuts was linked to lower PFAS concentrations in people's blood.
Wait, so nuts, good, but nut butter, potentially bad because of the packaging. That's confusing.
It does seem kind of counterintuitive, right? But I think it shows how important it is to, think about the whole picture, from how a food is grown or raised to how it's processed, packaged, and eaten. Every step can have an impact on those PFAS levels.
So snacking on almonds or walnuts, that might actually be a good thing in terms of forever chemicals.
Maybe. It's pretty cool to think about.
I love these kinds of surprising discoveries, but also makes me wonder if these chemicals are so widespread, is there any way to actually get rid of them once they're in the environment?
That is the million-dollar question, right? And scientists are working really hard to find answers. But the good news is there are some promising developments coming up.
Okay, tell me more. What's giving you hope?
Researchers are looking at a bunch of new technologies, things like electrochemical treatments and photochemical treatments. So those techniques, they use either electricity or light to break down PFAS molecules and basically render them harmless.
Wow, so it's like a tiny little death ray for forever chemicals.
I guess you could think of it that way.
Okay.
It's definitely exciting research. And another interesting approach is using something called deep UV light to degrade PFAS. It's a specific wavelength of UV light that's strong enough to break apart those chemical bonds.
This is where I get a little lost, but I'm trying to follow. So is this something that could clean up water sources that are already contaminated?
Potentially, yeah. And some water treatment plants are actually already using deep UV treatment systems. And there's a lot of research going on to figure out how to make it more efficient and affordable so it can be used on a larger scale.
That's really good to hear. Are there any other solutions that are being worked on?
There's also bioremediation, which basically uses tiny organisms, microbes, to break down PFAS.
Wait, so we're getting bacteria to help clean up our mess?
Exactly. Some types of microbes can actually naturally degrade PFAS. And so scientists are working on ways to kind of soup up that process, engineer microbes that are really, really good at breaking down these chemicals.
That's so cool. It's amazing how nature often has the answers, right?
It really is. It reminds us to look beyond just what we can create and learn from what nature's already figured out.
So while this PFAS problem feels huge, it's not hopeless, right? Science is giving us some reasons to feel optimistic.
Exactly. The challenge is scaling up those solutions, making sure that they can be used everywhere. And of course, we can't forget about prevention, right?
Right. We've talked a lot about reducing our exposure to PFAS that are already out there.
Yeah.
But what about preventing new PFAS from being made in the first place?
Yeah, and that's where things get a little more complicated. It's where, individual choices and policy and regulation all have to kind of come together. One of the sources we looked at talked about the growing movement to just ban PFAS altogether.
A total ban. That seems pretty drastic. Wouldn't it be enough to just, like, regulate them more carefully?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there's a lot of debate about what the best approach is. The people who support a ban, they argue that PFAS, because they're forever chemicals, they just pose way too much of a risk to human health and the environment. They think any exposure is too much.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I can see why people are concerned. It's not just about us. It's about, like, future generations, too.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that this isn't just like an environmental issue. It's a social justice issue.
What do you mean by that?
Well, studies have found that often the communities that are most impacted by PFAS contamination are marginalized communities. Communities that are near industrial sites or military bases where these chemicals have been used the most.
So it's about environmental justice, making sure everyone has access to clean water and a safe environment, regardless of their income or where they live.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why it's so important for us to work together, raise awareness, support groups that are fighting to ban PFAS, and advocate for better regulations. Every voice matters.
It's inspiring to know there are so many people fighting for this. It gives me hope that, we can actually make a difference.
Me too. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, but we're not alone in this, and every little thing we do can help.
This has been a lot, but also, so informative. I feel like I've learned so much about PFAS. And honestly, I feel a sense of hope, too, knowing that so many people are working on this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's easy to get bogged down in the bad news, but there are definitely reasons to be optimistic.
Well, listeners, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of forever chemicals. Yeah. And wow, we've covered a lot. From the science behind PFAS to how they're impacting our lives and what we can do about it.
We've explored the challenges, but we've also seen how resilient people are and how innovative we can be.
And maybe most importantly, we've talked about how much power there is in knowledge. We've got the information, and now we can make good choices for ourselves and for the planet.
So as we wrap up, we're going to leave you with a question to think about. As scientists are trying to figure out how to break down these forever chemicals, what can we do to prevent new forever chemicals from taking their place? That's something to really consider.
That's a good one to ponder. So until next time, folks, keep learning and keep exploring. That is a really good question. It seems like, we're always trying to catch up. We create something, and then we have to deal with the consequences. So how do we, break free from that cycle?
I think it has to start with, a different way of thinking. We can't keep trying to just control nature, right? We have to start working with it, collaborating.
So what does that look like in, real life?
It means bringing everyone to the table, right from the start. Scientists, policymakers, people from industry, people from the communities that will be affected, everybody.
So it's about having lots of different perspectives and thinking about the long-term impacts of what we're doing.
Well, exactly. We have to ask ourselves, okay, what could go wrong? How is this going to impact people? How's it going to impact the environment? Are there better, safer ways to do this?
It's like if we had been thinking that way all along, maybe we wouldn't be in this PFAS mess in the first place.
Probably not. We have to learn from our mistakes, and we have to create a system that's more focused on being careful and preventing problems before they happen.
It's like the old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Yeah.
Progress shouldn't mean sacrificing our health or the planet. We have to be smarter about it.
I agree. We have to be more responsible. And I think, more and more people are starting to realize that, which is good. There are some really smart people out there who are working on new materials and technologies that are actually safe.
So speaking of solutions, we've talked about filtering our water, choosing PFAS-free products, and supporting stricter regulations. But are there, bigger efforts happening out there? Are there communities doing things to clean up this stuff?
Oh, yeah. Definitely. Some places are getting really creative and coming up with some really innovative solutions.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, some towns and cities are installing these huge activated carbon filters to, scrub the PFAS out of their drinking water. And some places are trying out bioremediation. That's where they use microbes, those tiny little organisms, to actually break down PFAS in contaminated soil and water.
So even though they're called forever chemicals, we are finding ways to, get rid of them.
We are. It's pretty amazing what people can do when they put their minds to it.
That's good to hear. But it sounds, I don't know, expensive maybe. Complicated. Are those solutions something that, every community can do?
That's a good point. The cost is a big challenge, right?
Mhm.
Especially for smaller communities or for, developing countries that might not have the resources.
So it's not just about finding the solutions, it's about making sure they work for everyone, no matter where they live or how much money they have.
Absolutely. Everyone deserves clean water, clean air, a safe environment.
And that means we all need to do our part. And we need to hold the companies and organizations that created this problem accountable.
Yes, 100%. We need better policies, we need to support companies that are doing the right thing, and we need to hold polluters responsible for the damage they've caused.
It's about putting people and the planet first, before profit.
I think that's something we can all agree on.
Well, listeners, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the world of forever chemicals. Phew, it's been a journey, hasn't it? We've learned a lot about some pretty scary stuff, but we've also learned about some pretty amazing solutions and about the incredible people who are working hard to make things better.
We've talked about the science, the risks, and the solutions, and hopefully you feel a little more empowered now, knowing what you can do to protect yourself and your family.
Remember, this isn't a problem you have to face alone. There are tons of people out there, scientists, activists, everyday people who are all working towards the same goal. A future without PFAS.
So stay informed, get involved in your community, and keep pushing for change. We can do this.
Until next time, keep learning and keep exploring.